Welcome again on the Vintage Aviation News YouTube channel. Back in Dallas today at the national headquarters of the CAF. Exciting day ahead. We're going to meet with Brad Pilgrim and John Schauer. They both work on Fifi. Last time we were here, we interviewed Hank Coates, the CEO of the CAF. Today we're going to do something different, walk around Fifi and talk about the airplane as usual. Thanks for watching. Follow the channel, subscribe, and activate the little bell right here so you'll be notified every time we post a new video. So let's get into it. And here we are, John Schauer, flight engineer and mechanic on Fifi. We're going to do something different today. I'm going to grab the camera here in a second and follow John. He's going to talk about Fifi. So enjoy it. I'm going to move around the camera, John, and you'll be by yourself for a while, but we can both talk about the airplane. So tell us, how did you get involved with Fifi first?
Okay, I'm 67 years old, soon to be 68. I started in about 1970, 71 with the CAF. My dad was a member, and he had a friend that had a B-29, and I'd go down to the hangar with him on Saturdays, and they'd hand me a part and say, "Here, wash this, kid." Okay, I'd wash that part. And I'd start it out, and then I'd hold a wrench for somebody while they're tightening the nut on the other side, and then pretty soon I'm servicing the airplane with engine oil and fuel. And I got involved in mechanics of these old warbirds in 71, 72, and I've been doing it ever since. Been a member of the CAF since 1976. I've had my mechanics license for 49 years now.
Do you work in the aviation industry as a mechanic?
Yes, I was a airline mechanic for Eastern Airlines for 6 years, and then 36 years with American Airlines.
So I guess warbirds got your career started in a way.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. The question that everyone asks, how do I get involved? It's people from the outside don't realize that it's actually not that difficult to get involved, right?
It's not hard. If you're a CAF member, you come on out, find out where a local unit is, go out to their hangar, on a weekend when they're out there working, and say, "Hey, I'd like to get involved with this. Can I help out? Can I wipe oil?
Sure.
Can I polish the airplane? Whatever." You get started on it like that.
Very good. All right, we'll take a quick break, and then we'll go, I guess, around the airplane so you can talk.
I'll give you a walk around.
Right, very good. Let's go.
As a flight engineer, one of my jobs is to do a pre-flight before we fly this airplane. We usually start at the nose, make sure the tires are good. This is the nose landing gear. There's no nose wheel steering on this. The pilots have to use differential brakes, differential power. We got a shimmy dampener, make sure there's no leaks and stuff like that. You check your strut for inflation. Here's your oleo strut. It's a shock absorber. That extends once the landing gear is off the ground, and that cushions your landing. Walk around, and take the pitot cover off. This is where the airspeed is indicated in the aircraft. You're walking around for general condition.
And one thing that we noticed that you are connected to the pilot with headsets. So
yes.
Very often you see a long cable. That's what it is. You guys are communicating, right?
Right. Just walking around, making sure everything is where it should be. This aircraft used to have turbo superchargers, and this was where the turbine wheel was, and this is where the wastegate that adjusted the flow through the turbo. All of that has been removed because we don't fly at altitude, we don't pressurize anymore. It's just for looks. Keep it original as possible. And it's got an 18-cylinder engine. It's 3,350 cubic inches, and these engines are rated at about 2,200 horsepower. It's got a 16.5-foot diameter propeller. If you look around here on the front, and when I do a pre-flight inspection, I look through the intake and look up in the engine there and get a ladder and look at it all. Make sure everything is there. Make sure it's airworthy. That's the biggest thing, is keep these things airworthy. And
well, since we are on the subject, what does it take to keep these birds,
I'm guessing it probably takes 20 hours of work as a mechanic for 1 hour of flying. That's just a
20-to-1 ratio.
Yes. That's one guess. And then, check that engine, and then you walk around the wing. And then we got the main landing gear we check. A much bigger, more massive tire. We've got looking for the brakes, hydraulic brakes, looking for leaks, looking for all the structure up here. And one neat thing unique about the B-29 is the only hydraulics is for the brakes. The landing gear is retracted by electric motors. The flaps are retracted by electric motors. And there's no power assist on the controls. It's all Armstrong. Muscles Armstrong method.
Perfect.
And looking for fuel leaks. We've got big fuel lines that run through the landing gear here, or the wheel well. Okay. Looking for leaks.
All right.
If you look at the aileron here, it's fabric covered, and it's over 20 feet longer. It's longer than wings on a lot of the light Cessnas, decathlons, and light aircraft. And it's covered with fabric. Back in the old days, the whole aircraft was covered with fabric. In World War II, all the metal airplanes, they generally had fabric-covered control surfaces. And I've never heard of a good reason why, so I can't answer that question. The aircraft, the B-29, was pressurized. The forward section was pressurized, and the aft section was pressurized. In between, we have two bomb bays. And if you look, you can see the forward bomb bay is open, and here was the aft bomb bay doors are closed. We're doing a little maintenance on it and checking things out. Okay, here we are inside the forward bomb bay of the B-29. The aft bomb bay is similar, only it's backwards. The original B-29 doors were opened up electrically, and they opened up real slow, like a B-17. And they realized at high altitude, with the doors open, it would slow down the airplane enough to throw the bomb sight off. So they came up with a system where it was pneumatically operated. And if you look up in the corner here, there's a small little pump up there. It's an air pump. It pumps pressure into an accumulator up to about 1,500 psi. And these doors are now operated pneumatically. They open in about half a second, and they'll close in about 3 seconds. And this is all mechanism right here that's used to operate. We got the two air cylinders and then a four-way valve that's solenoid operated. One side opens it and one side closes it.
And I was just listening to you guys earlier, and it sounds like you're going to try to open them in flight after several years.
Several years.
Yeah.
We haven't operated them in flight for quite a few years. It takes a little bit to maintain it, and that's what I've been doing the last couple days, is getting it operational again. Of course, we got to take everything out of the bomb bay to do that. Normally we have ladders, and we got some fake bombs in here, and that all had to be removed so we can open it so we don't drop anything on the ground.
Makes sense.
And what you're looking at now is the tunnel that you could get from the front of the aircraft to the rear of the aircraft in flight while it was pressurized. Like I said before, the bomb bays were not pressurized. Before we fly, we do a pre-flight. The engineer does a pre-flight, and it takes about an hour to do one. Of course, we've been around the airplane, so we're always constantly looking at it. And then once a week, we do a weekly inspection with a little bit more thorough. We check tire pressures, any other minor defects in the maintenance of the airplane. And then we do a 50-hour inspection after 50 hours of flight time, which is a more thorough inspection. And then
how long does it usually take to do a 50 hours?
If you have 2 or 3 guys, people to do it, it's about 3 days, 4 days. You know, you're doing a pretty in-depth inspection. And then in the wintertime, starting mid-November till late February, March, we'll be doing winter maintenance, where we're tearing the airplane apart, opening up all kinds of access panels, doing inspections, and repairing anything that we find wrong. A lot of people, while we're out on tour with the aircraft, wonder, what's this? And we say it's a tail skid. It protects the rear of the aircraft from damage if you over-rotate on takeoff or landing. This red part here is made out of steel plate, and if you look carefully, you can see it's been worn down quite a bit. And one of our whenever a pilot hits it, he has to buy us a bottle of whiskey, us mechanics. We repaint it red, and then he has to autograph it on the bottom plate here with his name.
So I guess you kind of want the pilot to do that, right?
Yes.
So you'll get a
Yes. And if you look forward, everybody asks about these. This is the gun turret. All the turrets on this thing are remote control. We had gunners sitting in these plastic bubbles with a remote control gun sight and a rudimentary computer. It was stored in the belly of the airplane, and all the gunner had to do is just aim at the airplane and hit the trigger, and the computer would compute the lead that you had, to follow the aircraft, how far away, distance, everything like that. It was very simple, and it was very accurate system.
All right, let's talk about the fuel tank, John.
All right, there's 4 fuel tanks on this, and each fuel tank comprised of either 4 for the inboard fuel cells for number inboard tanks, and there's 7 cells that comprise of the outboard fuel tanks, and they're all interconnected. And the outboard fuel tanks will hold 1,320 gallons, and the inboard tanks will hold 1,410 gallons. And this aircraft, for a total of about 5,620 gallons of 100 octane avgas. Each engine burns about 100 gallons an hour in cruise flight. It's a whole lot more than your little automobile that you drive around on the street. And it's a lot of light aircraft. I was talking to a pilot this morning, and he gets about 18 gallons an hour cruise in his airplane, and this thing gets 400 gallons an hour in cruise. So it's quite a bit. Each engine has an 85-gallon oil tank. A lot of people ask, well, how many quarts of oil does this thing use? And I say, we don't talk in quarts, we talk in gallons. 8,500 per engine. So it's quite a bit of oil.
All right, John, here we are in, I guess what it will be your office.
This is my office as a flight engineer. Look at the instruments that I've got to do. The pilots that sit to my back, to the rear, they face forward, I face the rear of the aircraft. They've just got 2 instruments, an RPM gauge and a manifold pressure gauge. I have everything else. And I start the engines, do run-ups on it, control all the mixture controls, propeller controls, everything. And the ignition system, temperatures, fuel pumps, fuel systems. It looks complicated, but my dad was a flight engineer, and I asked him when I was a kid, well, how do you keep track of all these needles? And he said, as long as they're all pointed in the same direction, you're okay. It's when you see a needle like deviating from that, then you pay attention to that. It's a complicated job to get the engine started because each one is different. You might need a little more fuel for this, a little more throttle for that one, and they're sensitive to that. But once they're up and running in cruise flight, I can sit back and relax. I can look out the window and look at the countryside going by, and it's fun.
So I mean, what I always refer to, these airplanes have souls. They have a personality.
Yes.
So I guess as a flight engineer, you get to know each engine.
Yes.
And you know how each one starts, operates, almost like having a person to deal with, right?
Exactly. Each engine is a little bit different from the other one. You might have to have the lever in a little bit different position to keep it running correctly and all that. It's a simple. It looks complicated, but after flying it for so many years that I've been doing it, it's easy. It gets easier and easier every year.
Can you try to mimic a startup, I guess, sequence for at least one engine?
Okay, we're going to start number 4. We got the mixture control and cutoff.
So left to right, 4.
This is 4,
yep.
3, 2, and 1. 4, 3, 2, and 1. And the switches are all labeled the same. We got the mixture control and cutoff, and the throttle is just cracked open slightly. We turn a fuel pump on, so we got fuel pressure out to the carburetor. And then you have to have 2 fingers for a starter switch, and then the booster coil for the ignition switch. And then you use your thumb on the primer switch. So it's 3 fingers down here. First of all, you get the engines turning over. You got to go through 8 blades to make sure it's not hydraulic locked. And then you reach over, turn the ignition switch on, and then you start hitting the primer. And you sometimes you put complete prime on all the time, or you, what I call tickle it, you on and off. And pretty soon the engine will start to catch, and it catches, and once it starts to operate correctly, you stay on steady prime like that and let the airplane or the engine settle down. Just nice steady, you got oil pressure. And once it's steady like that, you bring your mixture into auto lean. And then you watch your RPM gauge for a little bit of a drop because it's running too rich because you got primer and the mixture for the carburetor. You let off on the primer and then you'll see it rise in RPM, and that indicates that your primer has shut off. We've had it one time where the primer stuck open and we couldn't keep that engine running, and it took a while to figure it out. And so we've got a procedure where we watch for that drop, release the switch, and watch for the rise. That's basic, simple engine start.
Right. Well, John, thank you so much. That was
You're
a
welcome.
great tour. As a reminder, I want to emphasize this. This is not a mission impossible. Anyone really can join the CAF. Go on commemorativeairforce.org, find your unit, and really anyone. What do we need to be here? Time, passion, and just time to dedicate to these great warbirds. So,
and it's a learning experience. You know, I've been doing it for 50 years, and I learn stuff every day. Every time I work on one of these, I learn something new every time.
Well, awesome. Thanks for your time, John. Again, commemorativeairforce.org. You want to put a little website right here. Find the unit closer to your home and join us. Thanks, John. All right, we're here with Brad Pilgrim. Brad, I've been wanting to do this for a long time. You've been on the Vintage Aviation News channel before, being on our magazine and stuff, but we never did a walk around, so I figured it would be a good opportunity. We just talked to John.
Right.
But you know so much about the CAF history. You've been around the CAF airplane since you were a whole child, and you grew up with the CAF, right? So
pretty much.
You probably and you were a flight engineer in Fifi as well.
Yeah, I've been a flight
engineer.
So
I think you're probably the best guy to talk about Fifi, its history, how it got into the CAF, because you know it's a known story, it's a known history, but you know not everyone knows about it. So why don't we start from there?
Yeah. Well, the airplane came out of the factory in Renton, Washington in 1945. Too late to go to the war because the war ended not 2 months after that. But the airplane kind of went into various training roles, and it was a fully equipped bomber. I mean, it was all ready to go to combat. The interesting thing about it was it came out of the factory black on the bottom. A lot of people don't know that. They think that the black bottoms didn't come in until the Korean War, or even done in the field in World War II. That's not true. Fifi and a lot of others from 2 different production lines came out with the black bellies. The airplane wound up going into storage after the war ended, and then it got pulled back out of storage, became a trainer again. Various times it was converted to what they called a B-29, and some of the turrets were removed, some of them were put back at various times during its life. There's really never figured out exactly at what point in its life how it was equipped at certain times. We know what it was doing for the most part, but one of the things that it did, it was interesting, is there's a kind of a gap in its service where it appears on the record cards that it was assigned at a certain unit, but in reality it wasn't there. And I acquired a guy's logbooks and certificates from Atomic Weapons Delivery School, which was in New Mexico, and this I want to say was in 1951. I can't remember exactly. And Fifi was in his logbook as having been one of the airplanes he flew at Atomic Weapons Delivery School. One of the things that we heard when we got the airplane was that it had been modified to carry atomic weapons. Now, everyone knows, or most people know, that the silver plate B-29s were the ones that Paul Tibbets had from the factory that were converted, or built at the factory to be atomic-capable airplanes. Then later on, you had what was called the saddle tree airplanes. Those were standard B-29s that were modified to become atomic-capable airplanes. And so what happened with this airplane, from what I can tell, is we know that it had some strange modifications to it, ECM antennas and all that didn't really fit into the story of what the airplane was doing as a trainer. There were some modifications inside the airplane, besides electronics, that led us to think that it might have been an atomic delivery airplane. The problem is we know which airplanes were converted from the factory. We know which airplanes were converted in the field by the military because we know all the serial numbers. And Fifi doesn't fit any of those. And what, in actuality, what we figured out has happened was the airplane was sent to the Atomic Weapons Delivery School in New Mexico and was used as a trainer. It never dropped an atomic bomb, because once again, we know exactly which airplanes did that in training and in combat. So it never actually dropped an atomic bomb, but what we are 99% sure of is that this airplane was converted into a systems trainer at the very least. And it was flown that way because the guy whose logbooks I have his graduation certificate from the Atomic Weapons Delivery School, and Fifi is listed in his logbook several times. And one of the things that kind of, I want to say proves this, but goes a long way to proving it, is right here. There's this little square panel. No other B-29 that I have ever seen has this panel. Underneath this panel is a jack point, like where you stick a jack to lift the airplane. If everyone remembers the videos from Tinian during World War II when they loaded the atomic bombs, they put the bombs down in a pit and backed the airplane over them and then raised the bomb up in it. What they did with the B-50, which was, the later version of the B-29, had bigger engines, totally different airplane, but it looked a lot like a B-29. The way they loaded those was they put a jack point right here, and they lifted the nose up off the ground so that you could slide the bomb underneath because they didn't have bomb pits everywhere. Fifi has that conversion. It's the only B-29 I've ever seen. I've looked at just about all the surviving ones. None of them have these. Enola Gay doesn't have these. Boxcar doesn't have these. This was done on airplanes that were converted to carry atomic weapons. Go back to the serial number list. We know it was never a saddle tree airplane. We know it was never a silver plate airplane. But at some point in its career, which is during that gap that I said was in its records, it was converted to at least have the systems and the loading procedures for an atomic airplane. So that makes Fifi kind of really rare. The other interesting thing about the airplane is when it went to, its life as a trainer was over, it was sent to China Lake, along with a bunch of other B-29s, and they were going to be used as targets. And the reason they did that was they could pressurize these airplanes on the ground and shoot them with different projectiles and see what kind of damage happened to pressurized airplanes. And so that's why B-29s were specifically used for those kind of tests. Fifi, just by pure luck, never got used for that. And whenever we got the airplane in 1971, which is a whole other story, when we got the airplane, there was no records for it. There's no logbooks, no anything. We don't know how many hours are on the airplane. I met a guy in San Antonio one time when I was still flight engineering at the air show there, and he said that he had delivered Fifi, and he proved it with his logbooks once again. He delivered Fifi and 2 or 3 other B-29s to China Lake. And I asked him about the paperwork, and he said that in the back Bombay there was a wooden crate that had all the records and logs and everything for the airplane. When they got to China Lake, they took all that out of the airplane and threw it in the burn pit and burned all of it. And I asked why, and he said because when they started blowing airplanes up on the range out there, the paperwork in them would scatter all over the range. And so the Navy didn't want paper blowing everywhere, so they just started burning all the records. So the only thing we have is in December of 45, Fifi had a landing accident when it was still painted black on the bottom, had a landing accident in Colorado during a snowstorm and hit, I think it was the number 1 and number 2 engine. Those propellers hit the ground and all that. So whenever the accident report was written up, I think the airplane had 65 hours on it at the time. That's the only time that we know was on the airplane. Obviously, it had a couple thousand hours or something. But when we started the logbooks over in 1971, when the airplane left China Lake, it left 0 hours. The airplane flew to China Lake, from China Lake to Harlingen in 1971, August of 71. It set and then was restored, and then started flying again in October of 1974. And it's been flying ever since, with the exception of the times for extended maintenance, like when we did the engine changes and stuff like that. CAF first started, it was all just frustrated fighter pilots. So they started out with a Mustang, then it wound up with 2 Bearcats and a Mustang, and then as the story goes, somebody came along with an A-26 and said, oh, you don't know fun until you've flown an A-26. Next thing you know, they got a B-17, then a B-25, and so they found themselves in the bomber business. The CF had a member named Vic Agather, who was a very successful businessman down in Mexico. He was an early member of the CAF. He was very responsible for us acquiring the B-24 from Pemex, from the Mexican National Oil Company. But Vic, during World War II, he had been essentially the Army's liaison between the Army Air Corps and Boeing, and was heavily involved in the design and build of the B-29 and the Battle of Kansas, where they converted all the airplanes to the same standard because they were coming off the production line so fast. You had about 40 different versions of the airplane because there was nowhere to stop the production line to get all the mods up to standard. So all the airplanes went to Kansas in the wintertime and were all converted to the same standards. And then they went on to India and then later to the Pacific. Well, Vic Agatha was very responsible for a lot of that. But anyway, he was a member of the CAF, and he, when the war ended, he said he got out of the B-29 and swore he'd never get in another one. But as he says, it kind of leaves its mark on you and you never get it out of your mind. So he decided the CF needed a B-29. And he looked at a couple of different ones, had made an offer on one. In fact, it's one that Kermit Weeks owns today. It was still flyable at the time. But through a series of unfortunate events, the CF didn't end up getting that one, and it went to another buyer. And so they went back to China Lake, and Roger Baker, who was also an early CF member, had seen these B-29s all sitting out there in the desert out on the range. And Roger had told the CF about them. So he went out there, and Vic Agatha told him, you go pick a B-29, and I'll pay for it. I'm going to fund this restoration and the acquisition of this airplane. And so they did, and the reason they picked this particular airplane, they narrowed it down to 5, and this one was kind of in the center of a group of several, and because of that was kind of protected from the elements to an extent, and didn't have a lot of broken glass. Now, when I say that, they still had to replace nearly all the glass on the airplane. It's often said that this had the least broken glass. In actuality, it was the one that didn't have the worst broken glass. So they replaced most of it. They picked this airplane because it was in the best shape. Like I said, they didn't have the logbooks or nothing like that. They flew it out of there in 9 weeks of work, got the airplane flying, 6 hours, 38 minutes, brought it to Harlingen, Texas, did a couple of passes and landed, and everybody thought that would be the last it ever flew because the Air Force, who actually owned the airplane, had put a one-time flight restriction on it. Vic Agatha, over the next several years, had enlisted to help Barry Goldwater and other people like that, and was successful in getting the one-time flight restriction removed. And Vic and the Agatha family funded the restoration of this airplane. And in October of '74, when they started flying the airplane again, or were getting ready to fly the airplane again, they were trying to come up with a name for it and markings and all that. And the airplane was painted just this, silver, and had the national markings on it, but didn't have markings on the tail or a name or anything. And Vic wanted to name it Thumper, which was a famous B-29, and he had known the crew in the Pacific and was friends with them. He wanted to paint it in those colors. But the general staff took it on themselves to come up with a name for the airplane, and they named it Fifi in honor of Mrs. Agatha, Vic's wife, because of the family sacrifice, her sacrifice, all the mink coats and everything else that she never got because all of it went into the B-29. So that's where the name Fifi comes from. It's named after Mrs. Agatha. And then the big A on the tail fin, there was a man named Charlie Day down in San Angelo who had a paint shop, and he's the guy who painted the airplane originally. And the airplane didn't have anything on the tail, and he was waiting for instructions from headquarters on what to paint. And the general staff waffled back and forth. They were going to paint CAF on it. They were going to put, specific unit markings. No one could decide. And so Charlie was sitting looking at a book, and he told me this himself. He was sitting looking at a book that had all these different tail markings for B-29s, and he saw the big squares that had different letters in them, and then he saw just the big block letters. There was a big block A, but there wasn't an A inside a square. And he said he waited and waited, and the airplane was clogging up his ramp. He said nobody told him what to paint. And he thought, well, the Agatha family's put so much money into the airplane, I'll just put the A for Agatha on there. And that's what he did. That's where the big block A came from. And it's been that way since 1974. And it's still very much a source of pride for the Agatha family. And it's kind of their brand. And it's known all over the world as the tail of Fifi. So that's where the name and the markings come from. We get asked pretty often how come there's names on the engine cowlings. It was not really well known in the Pacific, but in the European theater, you saw a lot of names on windows where the crew members were, on the gun turrets where the crew members were, but also on the engines where the crew chiefs would name their engines. They did have them in the Pacific, and there were some airplanes like that. The reason that these are named Rita Hayworth, Betty Grable, all 4 of them are named after pinups, famous pinups from World War II era. And when we first started putting the new engines on the airplane, the first engine that was built went in the number 3 position. The second engine that was built went into number 4. And then the third engine went in number 2, fourth engine went in number 1. That's kind of the way it happened. The engines were built in a different order than how they were hung on the airplane. Well, John Agather, who is Vic and Fifi's youngest son, he was like, well, which engine's this now? This engine we're paying for, this is the first engine, but it's actually engine number 3. And so they were getting confused on engine number 3 and the first position and all this. So they just started naming them. And he said, well, let's just name them after pinups. And so that's where the names come from. And number 2 is Mitzi, for Mitzi Gaynor, who was notoriously hard to get along with during her time as a pinup star. Everyone says she was just a very difficult person to deal with. And that was the engine that we had the most trouble with.
I guess it's appropriate for that engine.
It wound up being, with the first engine we had on the airplane, the first number 2 engine, it was a very appropriate name. Now, the engines, all 4 of them are different engines, and they're all in different places, but we just left the names on the cowling so that every number 4 engine is always going to be Rita.
So I also discussed this with John, and I always say that these airplanes and the engines as well, they have souls. They have their own personality, right?
Oh, yeah.
Everyone acts a little differently, almost like having 4 different children.
We were, when we still had the airplane in Addison, Texas, Jim Cavanaugh, whose name is on the Bombay, he was the man who founded the Cavanaugh Flight Museum. He gave us a couple of $1 million to complete the re-engine process. He's the reason that the airplane is still flying today, him and the Agatha family. But whenever the airplane was sitting there in that hangar, me and Dave Miller, who used to be the crew chief on it, we were working on an engine one day, and there was, I forgot what it was, AC/DC or some kind of rock music was playing on the radio. And we were trying to get one of these turbo housings off one of the engines. And I mean, we kept getting wrenches stuck, bolts were getting seized, and nothing worked. And finally, Dave got mad and he said, that's it, Fifi. He said, you just don't want to hear this kind of music. We'll put on something that you like. And he went over to the toolbox and changed the radio and put on, big band music, Tommy Dorsey music kind of stuff. Came back over and every single bolt we touched was like butter. It just came apart. And he just looked at me and he goes, I told you, Fifi has a certain taste of music. She likes stuff from her day and time. And I believe that. They have a soul. Each engine has a soul. The airplane has a soul. And anybody who thinks otherwise is just wrong. And that's all there is to it. Several years ago when I was engineering the airplane, I think we were in Birmingham, Alabama doing rides for the weekend. And we had finished flying for the day and we're doing cockpit tours. And I'm back here trying to work on the airplane. And we don't normally let people in the back on tour because it's just there's one way in and out and there's a lot of stuff to run into or whatever. There's a pressure bulkhead back here you got to go through. It's a small entryway. But I was standing over here doing something to the tail skid motor, and this little old lady walked up to me and she pointed at this bubble behind me on the right side. She said, is that where the right gunner would sit? And I said, yeah, it is. And she said, can I go in there? And I said, she had a walking stick and was hunched over. And I said, well, we don't normally let people back there. It's just too hard. She goes, my brother was a right gunner on B-29s. And I said, you know what, let's get in there. So I went and got the ladder and put it in. Me and her climbed up in there. And she said, do you mind if I sit down in that seat? And I said, no, you go right ahead. Just a dear little old lady. She sat down in the seat and looked out through the gun sight that was installed. And she said, my brother went to war when I was 11 years old. She said, he used to write me letters and told me that whenever he came back home from the war, he wrote me this, when he came back home from the war, he was going to teach me how to drive. She said, and he always had this list of things he was going to teach me how to do. She said, he was my hero. And she said, his airplane got shot down in July of 1945. And she said it was missing in action. He was never found. His body was never found. She goes, I'm an old woman now. And she said, I think she said she was 80 or something like that. She goes, I'm an old woman now and I'm terminally ill. And she goes, I just wanted to come see where my brother died at, where my brother fought his war at. She said, he was my hero and it's been 60 years. She goes, but I still miss him. And she said, so I can go home and I can die peacefully now because now I have been reconnected with my brother. And me and her just sat back here and cried for 45 minutes. And that's the neat thing about touring with the airplane. And, I've sat across while engineering the airplane, had old engineers who were shot down during the war who sat and basically gave me a check ride and told me, oh, you did okay for a young guy and stuff like that. I mean, these airplanes are time machines. They turn old people into young people again. They connect families with family they never knew. I had a man and his wife in Florida the first year we were back out touring. He came up, followed us to 3 different stops. and 3 different tour stops out throughout Florida. And finally, they bought a ride and sat across from me. I was in the engineer's chair, and I said, well, why did you wait this long to buy a ride? And he said, well, my dad was a B-29 pilot, and he got shot down before I was born. He said he never knew me. He knew I was coming, but he never knew me. And he goes, I never knew him. He said, I had a wonderful stepdad, and he said, I have no complaints. He said, but I just wanted to come see what my dad did. He said, to be honest with you, he said, it took me a long time to get up the nerve to actually sit in here while we flew the airplane. And he came back after that and bought 2 more rides at different stops. And then the next year he bought a third ride. So these airplanes are time machines. It's one of the important reasons that you have to keep flying them, even with the immense amount of money that it takes and the dedication of the maintenance crews and the flight crews and all. And that's why the CAF does what it does, is this is the link between now and then. This is what people who flew over Tokyo in World War II, this is what they did it in. And the kids back then that are now old people, that's their connection to those days and to their family members, many of them, far too many of them, who didn't ever come back home. So it's what makes it such an honor to do this. Yes, it's fun. Yes, it's a lot of fun. But it's really an honor to be able to do that and connect people to their families and let people genuinely experience the past rather than just watch it sitting static somewhere. It's a different experience when you're inside there.
All right, we already shot a end of the video, but I think last piece that we filmed was very special. So the best part of our organization, it's really that anyone can join. So, and the story you just told us, it's probably the reason we do what we do. We volunteer our time, money, and many times away from families because the airplane goes on tours. But again, it's not that complicated to be a CAF member. You got to join and have the time and the passion to do it. Right?
We basically need you to do things. We need you to pay your money and join the organization. We need you to come out and be willing to do a lot of work, put in a lot of sweat, sometimes for not a lot of thanks. And what you get in return is a magazine every month, some emails, and the opportunity to come do things like this. Because I was an 11-year-old kid from a little town in West Texas called Snyder, who, my family was not a well-off family or anything like that, but this organization gave me the opportunity to come be a crew member on World War II airplanes. And I haven't been just on this one. I've helped with other airplanes, but we need mechanics, we need scanners, we need people who do internet stuff. We need people who
office
work, people who will come sweep the hangars. It's the flying part's the glory part that everyone loves, but if you come out and you put in your time, you will get to fly in the airplane. You will get to go with it on tour. It takes your money initially, and then it takes your time and your family's buy-in on it, because you can't do this easily unless your family lets you do it or they come with you. My daughter's 25 years old and she's flown on more warbirds than most grown-ups I know, because she always came.
And many kids got their start in aviation because of being involved with the CAF. And
100%.
Another thing that I like the most is the friendship. We've been knowing each other for so many years. Well, we don't see each other often, but when we see each other, it's like now time went by, and it's like yesterday.
It's a lot like the military. I spent 20 years in the Air Force. It's all like the military. You run into people, you meet them once, and then you don't see them again for 30 years. But you remember them and you pick up right where you left off, because you are in a common position and you have a common interest. And quite honestly, I've done it for fun and I've done it for a living, and there's nothing I would rather do than play with old airplanes.
Well, that's very easy now. All you have to do is go on commemorativeairforce.org. I will put the URL right here, and join us. It'll be fun.
You'll enjoy it.
Thanks.
You bet, man.